to Cohered, out of Tumult and Chaos, the poetry of Walt Whitman. And those of you who know, those are some wonderful lines from Walt Whitman. I'm Francis Levy. Ed Intercessi and I are co-directors of the Philip Center. And tonight we have some of Cody Walker's books that are on sale afterwards. And I'm also pleased to introduce Cody Walker. Cody Walker lives in Lenox, Massachusetts, where he serves as the 2009 Amy Clampett Resident Fellow. His first poetry collection, Shuffle and Breakdown, a two-time finalist for the Anthony Hecht Poetry Prize, was published in 2008 by the Waywiser Press. The book includes a series of poems addressed to Walt Whitman, two of which received the 2003 James Boatwright III Prize for Poetry from Shenandoah magazine. He has taught seminars on Whitman in Seattle's Richard Hugo House and at the University of Washington, where he received the 2005 Distinguished Teaching Award. In 2007, he was elected Seattle Poet Populist. His work appears in the Best American Poetry, Slate, Parnassus, Shenandoah, Light, and elsewhere. He blogs for the Kenyon Review. Cody Walker will conduct this evening's discussion and introduce our distinguished guest. And before I say that, I've forgotten a very important thing. I'll say it in one sentence. We need your money, so please continue to send in contributions. Someone came in with a check today, and that means literally part of our rent was paid, and that's where we're at right now. So take it away, Cody.
Well, thank you, Francis. And yeah, I want to second that. Give Philoctetes a lot of money. They deserve it. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Ed, Polly, Adam, Hallie, Ellen, Mary, everybody behind this panel. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Matt Miller, who is here on my right. And Matt is assistant professor of English for Yeshiva University's Stern College for Women, where he teaches American literature and creative writing. He holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Iowa and an MFA in creative writing from the Iowa Writers Workshop. His book, Collage of Myself, Walt Whitman and the Making of Leaves of Grass, will be published in 2010 by the University of Nebraska Press. Matt's poetry has appeared in many journals, including the Colorado Review, the Denver Quarterly, New Letters, Open City, and Prairie Schooner. And I'll add that he has a book of poems coming out next year as well, along with his study of Whitman. So let me tell you just a few things about the program for this evening. How many people were able to print out the poems that appeared on the web as a PDF? So about maybe a third, half. Okay, we'll be referring to those a little bit. But if you don't have that packet, no worries. Whitman is a poet who, at least in my opinion, is arresting enough, and even I think accessible enough, although that's not a word I like a whole lot, to catch on first hearing. So if you don't have that packet, you'll be okay. What we're going to do is we're going to begin by Matt and I will each say a few words about why we're here, not just because Philoctetes asked us to be here, but how we got interested in Whitman to begin with. Sometimes I think it's good to have some idea as to how somebody arrived at a place like this. So we'll each say a few words about that. Then Matt has a slideshow / presentation / talk about Whitman as a collage artist. He'll talk about the central thesis of his book. Then we'll talk about some of the poems that are on that PDF. Respondé, Song of Myself, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. We will at some point read some of our own poems. And we'll also take questions. And we'll save, I think, at the end of the event, 15 minutes for questions, something like that. But I also want to encourage people to ask questions at any point. So if we say something that seems especially provocative or especially stupid or especially anything, don't feel afraid to, pipe up and let us know what you think. But so that being said, I'm going to, as I said, say just a couple of words as to how I got here as somebody who might be asked to talk about Whitman. I don't think I'd ever read any Whitman till I was in high school. And by the way, this is the sort of touchy-feely, at least for me, aspect of the talk, why I love Whitman so much. I don't think I'd ever read any Whitman until I was maybe in 11th grade. And we read some poems. I didn't even attach the name of Whitman to these poems, but we read a poem called Are You the New Person Drawn Toward Me in an English class. Later, I discovered it's from his Calamus section of poetry. At the time, I didn't know that, didn't know anything about Whitman, but the poem spoke to me. It's short, so I'm going to read it. It goes like this. Are you the new person drawn toward me? Are you the new person drawn toward me? To begin with, take warning, I am surely far different from what you suppose. Do you suppose you will find in me your ideal? Do you think it's so easy to have me become your lover? Do you think the friendship of me would be unalloyed satisfaction? Do you think I am trusty and faithful? Do you see no further than this facade, this smooth and tolerant manner of me? Do you suppose yourself advancing on real ground toward a real heroic man? Have you thought, O dreamer, that it may be all Maya, illusion? And I read that poem, and it spoke to me in the way that I think, maybe this is especially strong when you're in high school, but in my experience, it never quite leaves you. Do people like me for the right reasons? Are they seeing in me what I really feel that I possess? And what if they're not? And what a disaster that might be. And so I wrote my own version of this poem, and it stuck with me. But I didn't think of myself as somebody who was going to run off and read a lot of Whitman. Then I was in college, and I hated it. I was there for a semester at the University of Wisconsin. The lakes were all frozen over. It was minus 50 degrees. I would go out on Lake Mendota in the middle of the night and sort of wander around, wondering if I might crash through, not worried whether I would or not. And I had an English class where I was asked to explicate a poem. So I started flipping through the Norton Anthology, and I looked for a short poem, because that's what we do. And I found this one, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. It's 8 lines. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I sitting heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick. Till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical, moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. So I read that poem and I explicated it. I wrote a 6-page paper on it, and then I quit school because that seemed the right thing to do after spending some time with a poem like this. And I mean, there are all sorts of things I could say about this poem, why I think technically it's an interesting poem. It's one long sentence, which gives it this kind of momentum. It's divided up. It's got this volta, this turn right in the middle of it. After those first 4 lines, when, we get that turn. How soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick. The directness of that tired and sick, the sort of lusciousness of mystical, moist night air. The music of that last line, looked up in perfect silence at the stars. Here's Whitman, the great free verse poet, falling almost into iambic pentameters, if that's the music of the spheres. For all these reasons, the poem still interests me. I also distrust it in some ways, because I think it can be read as an anti-intellectual poem, and I'm afraid that Sarah Palin or somebody might be waving it around and saying, you're just supposed to not supposed to just hit your mic, but you're just supposed to feel from the heart and not learn anything and not sit under fluorescent lights and put your mind to work. And I don't think that's what he's saying, but I'm afraid sometimes it might be read that way. But it's a poem that has meant so much to me. Still, though, I didn't think of myself as somebody who was going to spend a lot of his life with Whitman. I'd started to think of myself as someone who liked Whitman. Then I was in grad school, and I started reading Whitman deeply. And then I started thinking, I need to read Whitman every day for the rest of my life. And he started to feel important to me, not just as a poet, but as a kind of example for a way to lead one's life. It's not the way I usually talk about poetry, but in Whitman's case, it applies. When he says at the end of A Song of Myself, failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged, missing me one place, search another, I stop somewhere waiting for you, I take him at his word. And so let's say I'd finally caught up with him properly when I was in my mid-20s. And some people do it much earlier, some people do it much later, but he does, I think, sit there waiting for you. And I'm so glad that so many people were able to come out tonight and catch him at least for these next 90 minutes. We'll see what happens. With all that mushiness, I now turn things over to the real Whitman scholar on this panel, Matt. And Matt's going to say a few words about his relationship with Whitman and then hit the slides.
Thanks. And thanks to the Philoctetes Center for inviting me to speak. I don't really remember how I first was exposed to Whitman. I suspect it was by way of reading Allen Ginsberg, who I think I liked first, but I don't recall. I immediately liked Whitman. My first favorite poem of his was "I Sing the Body Electric." I must not have been a very good reader of poetry at the time, because I was surprised much later to learn that the poem was describing the bodies of naked black slaves on the auction block in Louisiana. I just read it as bodies. But that poem still amazes me. More to the point, for what I'm going to discuss today, many years later, I found myself in grad school, and I wound up with a job as a research assistant. My particular job was transcribing Whitman's diaries, notebooks, and manuscripts into a computer code, XML, for an online website called the Walt Whitman Archive. I was just kind of drudge work, coding. But I kept discovering interesting things in the manuscripts, and I'd mentioned them to my academic advisor, the Whitman scholar Ed Folsom, widely known among Whitman circles as the dean of Whitman scholarship. And he was very encouraging about the things I was finding as I was transcribing these notebooks and manuscripts into this computer code. One thing led to another, and I kind of kept pursuing my ideas, and that led to my dissertation, which led to my book, which led to the job I now have at Stern College for Women on 33rd and Lex. And this is the first time I've presented my ideas from the book, so this is the flagship run. I would add that my interest in Whitman was further stoked by a trip to the Library of Congress, where I had the distinct privilege of being able to hold and really get close to the notebooks and manuscripts that he actually used. I'd been working with them from digital scans, from computer images, where they were huge. They seemed huge on my laptop screen. And I was shocked when I found out that they were actually this big, like about this, easily fitting in a normal shirt pocket. And that his handwriting, which if you've ever seen any images of his manuscripts, it looks like this sprawling, wild, chaotic scrawl. And it's actually a very meticulous, fussy handwriting, which was a big surprise to me. And as I looked through the folders and files at the Library of Congress, I kept finding scraps, things that didn't fit in anywhere, little pieces of paper that had been cut out, strips. And I came upon another manuscript, which I'll show you an image of shortly, where a bunch of these strips had been pasted one over another in different orders, palimpsest-like, or kind of like those flip books that you read when you're a kid. What's the name of that book? Tails, Body, Heads, that have monster parts that mix and match. You know what I'm talking about? And that's what the poetry compositional process seemed like to me. And I thought that was amazing. I'd never thought about, I was writing poems. I'd been writing poems. I already had an MFA. But I had never thought about writing poems that way. Cutting my poems up into little strips like refrigerator magnet poetry. And except where a line is the unit of poetic measure as opposed to just a single word, although sometimes he did cut out single words, and then rearranging them until you find your poem. And what I discovered was that while that was an extreme example of his writing process, it was characteristic in general of what he was doing. And that's sort of the background, I guess, of the book that I'm here to discuss, Collage of Myself, Walt Whitman and the Making of Leaves of Grass, and my ongoing fascination with Whitman.
So do you want to begin with the
Sure.
slideshow?
Sure.
Great.
So I want to talk about his writing process, and I want to begin by showing you a couple of pictures of his office. We don't have any pictures of Whitman's office from the early days when he was writing his great poems like Song of Myself, The Sleepers, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. But we do have images of his office from his latter days as he was dying in Camden, where his visitors would frequently visit him and were appalled and disgusted even, just like Emerson and Thoreau were all those years ago in 1855 when they visited him in Brooklyn, to see the state of his house, which was a constant disaster, a disaster which he cherished and encouraged. One of his friends hired a maid to clean up his house. He was a lifelong bachelor. And the maid came in, cleaned up all of his papers, alphabetized them by the first letter on the page, put them in neat stacks. He fired her the same day, cursed her out from top to bottom, said she'd ruined his meticulous order where everything had been kept exactly where he needed to find it. Now, we knew a lot about that his room was messy, and this was the more common of the images that you would see of his office if you were a Whitman person and you were inclined to research that sort of thing. But what we didn't know, and what I later discovered, was that there were a series of other photographs taken at the exact same time when this photograph was taken that were considered throwaway photos because the quality of the images weren't good enough. And one of those that I'm going to show you next is, I think, even more indicative of the chaos, the tumult and chaos from which his poems arose.
Wow. Matt, is this downstairs at the Mickle Street house, or what room is he in here?
This would have been downstairs. That's correct. Yes. So there you have it.
Wow.
He described his manuscripts as a sea, an ocean of paper, and that when he was stuck for a line, when he essentially had writer's block, he would reach down into the sea and fish around. He'd pull one out, and he'd there's a line. And then he would copy it out onto another notebook. And he would do this constantly. You can see what a mess he had to pull from.
I'm amazed this isn't a more famous photograph, or at least that I haven't seen it before.
Yeah.
Where is it?
Well, it's available online through the Walt Whitman Archive, which has every photograph of Whitman known available for all of you to look at, easily found at www.whitmanarchive.org. Look at the sidebar on the left. There's one that says photographs. It's fully searchable, or you can just browse the slideshow, whatever. It's easy to use. I insisted that I worked for the archive for many years, and I insisted that they put this supposed throwaway photograph up with the better quality one for what it states about how he wrote and the chaos he preferred to live in. Now, this was the older Whitman. This is a guy that had lived in this house for a long time and liked it that way. We can only imagine what it must have looked like when, in 1854, when he was writing all of his, what I think are his best poems, and he moved 7 times in 1 year in Brooklyn to different addresses. He was something of a real estate speculator. His father was, and he helped him. And he moved from house to house. Only one of those houses is still standing, 99 Ryerson in Clinton Hill, about 3 or 4 blocks south of where I live now. And the rest are torn down. But like I said, he moved 7 times in 1 year when he was writing his best poems. So I can only imagine that the chaos was that much worse. He was constantly bundling these scraps up. He would tie them up with twine in packs like this, and then untie them, and they would just spread everywhere where he lived. He writes about doing this. And I got to thinking about that picture, about the scraps I saw, and it occurred to me that what this is what we would today call collage. Most people, when we think of collage, we think of a visual medium of art, where there's scraps from newspapers or whatever kind of images pasted to a cardstock or whatever kind of background. But collage is a multidisciplinary phenomenon. Hip-hop artists collage beats and sounds. Poets such as Marianne Moore, T.S. Eliot, collage lines, like The Wasteland, how it steals from so many different sources, from Shakespeare to Dante, and puts it all together. And literary collage is a well-known phenomenon. Many critics have described literary collage as the signature method of modernity, both in the visual arts and in writing. I agree. I think it's the most important discovery of modernism, and it's the thing that postmodernism has taken and ran with the most. So it seems to be the more sustained of the inventions of the modernists, to my mind. And it occurred to me that the fact that no critic had acknowledged Whitman as either a or I think the source for that method, the predecessor for it, is shocking to me, and a serious gap in the history of modernism and of 20th century art. My argument in my book is easy to encapsulate in one sentence. Whitman invented collage. I don't argue that he directly influenced somebody like Picasso or Braque, who are usually credited with inventing collage. Collage, which in French means to glue, is usually accredited to Picasso, who glued pieces of newspaper to canvases. That's how art historians usually credit it. And then it moves into Duchamp and his ready-mades. But I think the more accurate assessment of the history of collage should go back to Whitman, and I'm going to show you why I think so.
Yeah, I mean, this may anticipate what you're about to say, but I mean, why did people miss that? Do you think is it because they haven't looked at the archives in the way that you and Ed have, or is there something else that was blocking them from seeing Whitman that way?
It's a good point. Scholars have long known that Whitman took from other sources. There's a Whitman scholar named Floyd Stovall, wrote a book called, I think, The Long Foreground of Leaves of Grass, and he talked about some of his sources. His work was invaluable in mine. But nobody had put it together in a theoretical way, that what this was. They saw that he was arranging things, but the scope and breadth and depth of it wasn't known. And in my research for the archive, the reason why it wasn't known, it was in part because the manuscripts are scattered over dozens of libraries all over the globe. Some of his manuscripts are in London, a couple of them are in Australia, a good many of them are at the NYPL, a lot of them are at the Library of Congress, that's the largest repository. But because the manuscripts were so scattered, it was difficult for scholars in a pre-digital era to understand the big picture. And when I had the advantage of having every single one of those digital images, gigabytes of them, on my laptop, moving them around and fitting them together in new ways, that made it more clear just how widespread the scope of his collage writing was. Also, a lot of boring academic legwork, looking up sources, basically. Like, I trained myself. I could kind of get the feel for when his poems were lapsing into collage, I should say. A lot of times it happens during his catalogs. You're probably familiar with those long catalogs in the middle of his poems where he names example after example of this or that. A lot of times you can kind of just tell by the texture that it didn't sound like something Whitman was writing or composing the way he would if he was speaking, something that he was composing the way you would if you were arranging. And I'd think, that list of birds, that seems like Whitman didn't write that. And so I would think, okay, so where would Whitman have been looking to find the names of birds and descriptions of birds? And so I would do research, old school, kind of old historicism, if you will, and I found out there was a book called, for example, The Birds of Manhattan, by a guy named Giraud. I forget his first name. And it was a widespread book, popular bird book, in the mid 1850s. And so I got it, and I read it cover to cover, and about 3/4 of the way through, I found the section that Whitman had stolen from, and there it was, with only a few words changed verbatim. The catalog, except it was in prose form, not in line breaks. A couple words changed here and there, but basically exactly the passage from.
How long a section are we talking about?
This particular section, it's about 8 lines of Song of Myself.
Yeah.
One of the many catalogs in Song of Myself. Another, perhaps better known example, the poem I referred to earlier, I Sing the Body Electric. As many of you know, it ends with a list of Whitman's, not of Whitman's, but of various body parts, a kind of catalog of the body. And that seemed to me like something he probably stole. So I found anatomy books, and I found the anatomy book that he had. And I read that, and I found it, and I went to it, and there was this picture of a human figure, vivisected. Is that a word, vivisected? With the call-outs and the labels of the body parts, and the body parts on the call-outs pointing to where they were, lung, shoulder, so on, were basically in the same order that Whitman used for that last section of I Sing the Body Electric. Whitman just copied it out, then added some of his own creative words for the naughty bits, man-root.
I was about to ask that. Man-balls and man-root.
Man-balls and man-root were not the words that the original anatomy book. Whitman had some colorful substitutes. So that's how I did it. Old school, looking up old, rather dull books and looking for the sources and then trying to put together a big picture. That's the aspect of his collage that comes from other sources. There's also the aspect of his collage which just comes from his own material. That's why my book is called Collage of Myself. And I think that aspect of it is even more interesting. So if you'll humor me for a second, a little bit of like Whitman scholar talk here. Prior to my book, Whitman scholars had thought that Whitman had been writing the poems for Leaves of Grass since 1847. That was the standard narrative of how Whitman had originated Leaves of Grass. That it had been written over a fairly short period of time still for such an important book, 7 years. But it turns out it's much, much, much shorter than that. I was able to date a manuscript. I call the manuscripts by the first legible words that appear on them. So the first words that appear on this are medcaphosis, which is a disease, an old name for an old disease, and probably meant a form of cancer. But anyway, so this manuscript, the medcaphosis manuscript, I was able to date this for sure to 1854 because of his mention of an event that happened then, the wreck of the ship, the San Francisco. He talks about it on the same manuscript. And in that same manuscript, he talks about Leaves of Grass. He talks about Song of Myself. He talks about a poem. He doesn't know it's going to be a poem yet. He says, a poem, question mark, a novel, question mark, a spiritual novel, whatever that is, a play, question mark, whatever it is, he says to himself, just writing to himself, involved many characters on a grand scale, not one speaker, but many speakers, the poet one among many, with long passages and rhapsodic music. And I won't go on too much, but he's clearly talking about Song of Myself here. I mean, there's no other later work of the scope. He also names the title to the poem, There Was a Child Went Forth, or the first line, since he didn't have a title in the 55 edition. And we see that line, There Was a Child Went Forth there, which, that's from the 55 edition of Leaves of Grass. So if we date this to then, and he's still struggling with lines from those poems and doesn't even know that the book's going to be a book of poetry. I mean, Whitman considered a career as an orator in the tradition of Emerson. He was a newspaper man, an editor, and his best-selling book during his lifetime was a temperance novel called Franklin Evans, which sold more copies during his lifetime than Leaves of Grass ever did. So it was not at all clear that this quirky oddball of a Brooklynite, Walt Whitman, was going to be a poet. It looked like he was just going to be a hack newspaper writer or a hack fiction writer that wrote temperance. He wrote Franklin Evans in a month for money, only for money. So the idea that this guy could become a poet always appealed to me. I come from a working class background myself. I always loved how Whitman was this guy that came out of nowhere with this crazy family and this dad that couldn't support them and somehow made it all work and did it on his own, with a self-made man, self-educated man. With no help and no money. The fact that he did this in 1 year made it even more amazing to me. So I think I've conclusively proven that Leaves of Grass was basically put together in a year. So you wonder, what do you do with that? How could he possibly have done that? The most important book of American poetry ever. How could he have written it in a single year? And the answer is that he didn't exactly write it in a single year. He collaged it out of stuff that already existed. He had all kinds of journals, diaries, notebooks, things like that. Notes for speeches he intended to give but never gave. Writings about sexual encounters with men that he had. Long listings of descriptions of men that he met on the street so that he'd remember their names. He'd write down the name of a man that he thought was attractive, and then he would write little notes about them. These notes later were used in the poems. He had all these things in his notebooks. They weren't in lines. They weren't poetry by anybody's normal definition of poetry. But in 1854, he discovered his line. He discovered this long line, this long, capacious, baggy line that we usually associate with the Bible. But he probably actually got more directly from a now forgotten poet moralist named Martin Tupper, who was a best-selling author that wrote a book of long-lined, sort of self-help poetry. Proverbial Philosophy was the name of it. It was vastly popular. It was a bestseller. Wherever he got the line, he found it. And once he found this capacious, baggy line with no meter and none of the interlocking strictures of poetry, anybody who's ever written a poem in form knows that it's hard to revise them because the rhyme scheme and the way the sounds fit together forms this sort of network that's hard to pull apart. And then but if you have lines that don't have those structures, it's much easier to arrange things, right? The loosest possible structure for poetry is probably a catalog. The only syntax there is the clauses one after another, right? There's no complex grammatical structure that complicates and nests the language within it. So once he found that sort of body or vehicle, it was easy for him to go back through all the things he had written, cut them up sometimes, cut them out of his notebooks with knife or with scissors, with glue, sometimes rip them out. He would write on his wallpaper, and in houses that he knew were going to be redone, he would write on the wall, rip the wallpaper off, stuff it in his pocket. There are examples of wallpaper at the Library of Congress. You can see the wallpaper glue on the other side, the thick paper with lines that later became parts of his poems on them, tied up in bundles of twine. And so that's the scene, what you see there, if not even worse, that from which the greatest, what most people recognize as the most important book of American poetry arose. Yeah?
What was the line?
The wallpaper line?
No, the line you were talking. When you said he got his line, you meant he got his way of doing things?
I meant the strophe, the overall idea of the line. The fact that just nobody had really was writing poems in these long free verse lines back then.
Right.
So it was something he must have discovered at some point. That he realized, I can be a contemporary poet and not rhyme. That was kind of weird back then. So what he discovered, I didn't mean any specific line, but just the model of the long baggy line.
Proverbial philosophy.
Yeah, I think that's where I think he always wanted to write the New American Bible, so I'm sure that the long free verse lines of the Hebrew prophets influenced him as well, but he had a more contemporary influence directly in this best-selling author. Whitman wanted to make money. After all, he had absolutely none, and he was tired of being a hack newspaper writer. And so he saw this guy that he thought of as a lesser talent, Martin Tupper, and I'm thinking maybe he saw him and his long free verse lines and thought, I can do that better. So anyway, well, why don't I show you an example of one of these manuscripts so that you can see what I mean. I don't know how clear that is, but can you see how you can see on the sides, if you look at the margins of the page, how they jut out in right angles, how this passage was put together. It's much more dramatic in person. Beneath that, there are more lines, and beneath that, yet more. And on the other side, there are other lines. And there are many examples like this, where we know from poems that we have a long manuscript background for, poems like Song of the Broad Axe, one of the ones that we have the most material for, Song of Myself, The Sleepers, that most of his poems went through, maybe not quite that fragmented of a manuscript process, but something somewhat similar. Sometimes the chunks would be this big, 10 lines. Sometimes it'd be a single line. Sometimes it'd be just a name of a body part. But his poems were built out of fragments and cohered around ideas. And he had a special word for these ideas. He called them spinal ideas. He liked bodily metaphors of the body. And he liked to talk about the spinal ideas that would hold his words together. He once described his writing process to a friend of his as untying, and he actually paraphrases this in Specimen Days, his prose book mostly about the Civil War. In a long footnote, he talks about how he went home, untied all of his fragments and scraps, picked them apart, and applied them to his spinal idea. And then the order came clear to him. And so he has these notes of the spinal ideas in his notebooks. And the notes will read something like, Poem of the Body. That poem later became I Sing the Body Electric. Poem of Sleep and Dreams. That poem later became The Sleepers. Poem at Sunset on the River, Crossing the Ferry. You probably know which poem that one became. Some of them never came to life. He had one called Insect Poem, which maybe it's better it didn't come to life, where he was going to celebrate the insects. He never wrote that one. He has another one called Banjo Poem, which I kind of wish he had wrote, but he didn't write that one either. But these spinal ideas were the centers of gravity for the fragments as they sort of constellated around these concepts. And Whitman was sort of, in some ways, the passive interface between the spinal ideas and the fragments. Much more of a composer and an arranger than this idea of a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions, if you will. It's spontaneous on the one hand because the fragments were written quickly. He would be riding on top of an omnibus in Manhattan, taking notes, stuffing them in his pockets, whatnot. Those parts were written quickly, spontaneously. But then there was the long rearranging and ordering process that took a great deal of time. So it's a two-stage process. There's the spontaneous, bam, there's the idea, there's the line, and then there's the long, meticulous composing and arranging process. And that informs most of his early poems and some of his later poems. Now, by the end of his life, his poems grew quite short, and he would stop doing it. He stopped being interested in the long poem or the medium-length poem, and he wrote poems, between 5 and 20 lines. Interestingly, though, a number of those late poems are described as what we would today call found poetry. If you've ever heard the expression found poetry, that's when you see something or hear something and you realize that if put in a poetic context, the found poem would take on a different meaning. So maybe you see the most famous example of a partially found poem maybe is Frank O'Hara's Lana Turner is Dead, which was a newspaper headline that later became a poem. So if you saw something on a billboard and you copied it down as a poem, that would be he invented that too. And these late poems are often described as found poems. There's one described as being overheard by miners. It's a lie. He never talked to any miners in Colorado. That's made up. But it's at least presented as if it was a found poem. Just something he didn't even write. He just heard it. Here it is, guys, found poem. So he shifted from this collage method to a found poetry method, maybe a lazier man's method. By the time he was old and infirm. But the big poems, the major poems that you guys probably think of when you think of Whitman, that's how they were written. So I thought what I might do, if you guys are interested, is I would maybe walk you through the process of just like one little passage of this, and show you how, to my mind, this really complicates and enriches our reading of Whitman. The passage that I have in mind is a passage from The Sleepers, which I'll put up there for you. I point it to you. If you have the packet, I'll show you where it is in the packet too. We're not going to do all The Sleepers, don't worry. It's just a little stanza there. But I'm going to show you the manuscript background for this and why it's interesting. Actually, okay, first let me talk about this. One more thing before we do that. He also theorized. You might ask, so yeah, he did this, but did he know he was doing it? Did he know he was inventing collage, that this was an important artistic method? Yes, he did. He definitely theorized it. And his theory name for it was poems of materials. And this is one of my favorite manuscripts. I don't know if you can read it, but I'll read it to you. It's underlined 3 times in the upper left and bracketed, the poem, one grand eclipsing poem, poem of materials, several poems, many poems on the model. They bring together the bringing together of the materials, words, figures, suggestions, things, words as solid as timbers, stone, iron, brick, glass, planks, etc. All with reference to ideas, main central idea. He later called those spinal ideas. With powerful indications, yet loose, fluid-like, leaving each reader eligible to form the resultant poem for herself or himself. And then there's this, I don't understand what he's, at the end there, it says leading Chicago poem, and I have no idea what that refers to. I've never been able to figure that out. If anybody has any clues, I'd love to hear it. But isn't that an amazing description of his project that he had in mind? Poems of materials, loose, fluid-like, leaving each reader eligible to form the resultant poem for herself or himself. I feel like if Stanley Fish were here, he would be, telling me this was reader response theory. And it kind of is. The idea of reader response is that the reader and the poet create an intertext between the two of them, right? And here we have Whitman in a more plain-spoken way talking about the same thing. So poems of materials, that's one of the chapter titles of my book, and I think a good way of describing his poems. That's why he was so fascinated. One of the reasons why he was so fascinated with the catalogs, because these catalogs offered the materials for people to build subsequent poems. They were in a way, like a more elegant and sophisticated version of those refrigerator magnets that are so popular today. Except instead of rearranging words on a surface in your kitchen as a part of a game, he wanted us to rearrange them in our consciousness as a mind-expanding and spiritual meditational practice. And he wanted to encourage the evolution of consciousness through this process. It's a little theoretical background. Now I'll go ahead and get to what I was going to say about the one example of reading through a passage. All right. So this is very hard to read, so I translated it for you on the right. This is Whitman here is probably writing a speech. We don't really know what this is. You can see at the top, you can barely see it. It says the poet in the far upper left. I don't know if you can make that out or not. It probably was him imitating Emerson's famous essay, The Poet, and thinking, okay, well, if Emerson did that, I could do that too. And so he was, I'm guessing that this was notes for a speech he hoped to give somewhere and get paid for. And it reads, I think 10 million supple-fingered gods are perpetually employed hiding beauty in the world. Hiding, I think that's what that says anyway. The words in brackets means I don't know for sure what they are. Hiding, burying it everywhere, in everything. But, and most of all, where in spots that men and women do not think of it, and never look, as in death, and, I don't know what that word is, and poverty and wickedness, cash and, hard to make that part out, cash and cash again, all over the earth and in the heavens above that swathe the earth, and in the depth of waters of the sea, there, or maybe they do not do their task, maybe jobs well. I think that's an overstruck word, actually. Those supple-fingered gods, journeymen divine, there's a page break. But only from the poet can they hide nothing, and would not if they could hide. Him they attend, wait on night and day, and show where they take, uncover all, and that he shall see the naked breast and the most private. And then there's a long blank spot. Do you see the blank spot there on the right? You see that? Private blank of delight, overstruck on the bottom, the very last words there. Do you see them? Right above the words, I think 10 million in print. So he leaves this blank in the MS, and he doesn't know what to write there. Maybe you've done that before when you were writing. You get stuck for a word, you leave a blank, you fill it in later. I guess you don't need to on computers anymore, but in the old days. And so, I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting. And some of those phrases were later used in other poems. The cash and cash again is used in the Sleepers. Other phrases are used in the Sleepers and Song of Myself, just pulled out here and there like he always does. But it was that private blank of delight that interested me. I thought there's something there, and I wanted to find it. And so I was looking all over. I spent a long time looking through manuscripts for what that was coming from. I thought the Sleepers manuscripts would be a good place to go. So I went to the Library of Congress again and went to them, and I found this one that people had talked about, but nobody had really talked about the other side. And on the other side of it, there were these seemingly unimportant notes with just little words and stuff, not lines of poetry. The previous Whitman scholars were more interested in the lines of poetry, and the other side had been ignored. And so I was looking at that, and I thought, oh, wait, what is that? And I'm going to show you it in parts here, a little more dramatic. In the upper left of the manuscript, we see these words: sweet flag, sweet fern, illuminated face, clarified, unpolluted, flower corn, aromatic, calamus, sweet gum, bulb, and melons with bulbs grateful to the hand. That seems like some pretty innocuous writing about plants. If we didn't know already later that Calamus was the cluster of poems that focuses on same-sex affection, then we might not think that this was anything particularly interesting with his poetry. It just might look like, sweet flag is another word for calamus, by the way. It's an old-fashioned word for calamus. Calamus, of course, is a grass. One of the types of leaves of grass that inform the title of his book, and his symbol for same-sex affection and love. Not that big a deal so far. But you keep reading on the same manuscript. And down below and in the right, I found this. Common things. The sweet, trickling sap that trickles overstruck, drops overstruck, flows from the end of the pole overstruck, little overstruck, manly maple, tooth of delight, tong, tooth, prong, tine, spent, spend. That's a little more explicit, I believe. And I thought, blank of delight. Tooth of delight. And so I went back and I looked through poems to see if this part had been used. And that's too small, isn't it? Do you know how to magnify that? I don't use Max. Is there a way to...
I'm not sure. Is this a PDF?
Is anybody handy with Max? It's Control Plus on PCs, but I want you to be able to read part of this.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Do you have, maybe you could share it with your neighbor if you have is the Sleepers in your packet?
It is, yeah.
This is...
Which section is this?
It's like 2/3 of the way through or so. There it is. Page 18. How many pages?
Yeah, I went ahead and numbered these, but it's 3 pages in on the sleepers. You get it begins on page 16 if you're counting, and then it's basically 3 pages into the poem is where we are there.
I'm stuck here.
It's the page that begins, "Double yourself and receive me, darkness, receive me and my lover too."
And the passage I'm interested in is 3/4 of the way down the page. It reads, "The cloth laps a first sweet eating and drinking." Is that the right part? Okay. "Laps life-swelling yolk, laps ear of rose corn, milky and just ripened. The white teeth stay, and the boss tooth advances in darkness. And liquor is spilled on lips and bosoms by touching glasses, and the best liquor afterward." So I didn't find the exact tooth of delight, but I found descriptions of plant metaphors being used as metaphors for the phallus, for body parts. And I found a passage that took from the previous one, the first one I showed you that I had transcribed in the bottom right. There's some phrases here you might recognize. And I realized just exactly what this was about, and nobody had talked about it before, but this is a very candid and frank description of a blowjob. And the tooth of delight is of course the penis, and the line "the white teeth stay and the boss tooth advances in darkness" becomes a little more vivid, if you will. And I just thought, how amazing is that Whitman could graphically describe oral sex in a poem and have nobody get it, or at least write about it. I suspect his friends and that gay men in Manhattan at the time did get it. I suspect this code was readily transparent to people who were ready to understand it. But on the other hand, he found a way of double coding it so that people who weren't ready to understand it, they would just pass over it. They might think, "Oh, that's kind of interesting. A boss tooth. What's that all about? I don't know. Maybe it's that a metaphor." It's a lot of weird stuff in this poem, The Sleepers, anyway. It's kind of surreal, dream images. But crammed amidst those dream images is a very vivid description of a blowjob.
Matt, my memory is that this is one of the more heavily revised poems. Does that passage make it into the final version as well?
Yeah.
It does,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah, it does. Well, actually, no. It makes it to 1881. I'm sorry. He actually did finally cut it in 1891. But it made it through 5 editions, suggesting he was comfortable with it enough until he was, in his 60s. So it wasn't like he did this and thought, "Oh my gosh, what have I done?" and cut it out right away. It lived through 5 editions of Leaves of Grass. He did actually cut it in the final edition, so let me correct myself on that. But I don't know. This kind of stuff really opened up a lot of doors for me into his poems. And there's countless examples like this. If I had more time, I would show you some others. This is one that I think is particularly provocative. And it shows him, as I said before, writing a language that's double-coded so that people that are not socially ready for descriptions like this can read it in one way, and people who are ready for it can read it in that way. And both parties can come away with satisfying readings. And that's, I think, a part of his genius, this poetry that works on this bifurcated level. So that's the end of my slideshow. And so I don't know, should we take some questions
Well,
now?
yeah, if people have questions, definitely. This seems to me groundbreaking, as it does to you. Could you talk a little bit about why this is interesting to you, not just in terms of Whitman, but in terms of the development of poetry in the 19th and 20th centuries?
Yeah, absolutely. You have an upcoming poetry talk here focusing on Mallarmé and Apollinaire, I believe. Mm-hmm. Both fascinated by collage. Zone, great poem, of course. Collages, images of the city, influenced by cameras and photography, just like Whitman was. The French surrealists, the Dadists invented the idea of the exquisite corpse, the now standard creative writing game for creative writing classes, where everybody writes a line and you cut them up and rearrange them. So this kind of collage-like writing process was really a hit in the beginning of the 20th century. And it was seen by the Dadists and by their painterly counterparts and the Cubists and some of the surrealists as a whole new way of discombobulating art and challenging standard assumptions about meaning, authority, and reading practices or viewing practices in the case of visual arts. The Wasteland, up until recently, perhaps the most famous poem of modernism, uses collage, as you probably know. But I don't think these people got it directly from Whitman. My argument isn't an argument of influence, but an argument of precedence. I'm not arguing that Apollinaire or Zone knew this stuff. They just wound up doing it. Whitman was just ahead of them. He loved technology, and so he was always ahead of the curve of technological innovations. He was the first major writer that I'm aware of that was totally obsessed with the camera and photographs. The second most photographed author of the 19th century, next to Mark Twain. And like so many things he invented, Whitman also invented the blurb. The first blurb, unfortunately, to my mind, the first blurb in history, of course, was Emerson's little statement, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career," which Whitman emblazoned on the spine of the second edition of Leaves of Grass without Emerson's permission. So there's the appropriately obnoxious and inillustrious history of blurbs, which have mushroomed into the monstrosities that they are today, sort of an excuse for the worst hyperbole you can get away with. This is another invention, this collage thing, a more important one, and one that has greater ramifications. And it really complicates how we look at the transatlantic set of modernism. We usually think of modernism as coming from Europe and arriving in America, right? We think of modernism as coming from the France, from Paris, right? From Gertrude Stein's salon, perhaps. Maybe that's the epicenter, perhaps. People can disagree, but I think the standard view is a one-way. Well, it's not one way because the American authors would go there and write, but if you want to boil it down to a chicken and an egg question, usually Paris, I think, would be thought of as coming first, and then Americans later.
Well, the Rosenberg thought that the abstract expressions were indigenously American, and that they were concrete.
Yeah.
That's an exception.
It is a messy picture. Yeah, I'm generalizing. I definitely generalizing, and there's room for argument about this. But I think it's not. I mean, if you buy what I'm selling here, I think we have to unequivocally say that at least in terms of literary history, not necessarily in terms of influence, but in terms of history, it starts in America, and it starts with Walt Whitman. And that's something I think we should, if you take pride in American art, that you should take pride in.
I had a question. Are we
Yeah, absolutely.
On the question of surreptitiousness of the imagery here in relation to the oral sex and fellatio, it's kind of interesting because we brought this up in the comedy panel also, where Louis Black was talking about the use of the word "fuck" and then what is forbidden, what are the possible double entendres. So here we have something which in the 19th century would have been very that he's basically footnoting in a very kind of camouflaged way. But now, I mean, how does this particular technique manifest itself? And when you invent a technique in poetry, or you set a precedent of the kind you're talking about, and you describe Whitman as our greatest American poet, how does this particular kind of nuance? This particular kind of thickening in the poetry, which performs many different functions at the same time, reflected in the work of poets, for instance, like Ashbery, or other poets who may deal with eroticism or homoeroticism, but for which there's no forbidden quality to it.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think the process is still extremely popular. And there's different theoretical words for it now that we use to talk about it. Obviously, the motive is different. It's not shocking anymore. So, you're not hiding anything. It's not duplicitous. We use one of the words you hear a lot in theorists is the word polysemic or polysemy. The idea of like one word meaning is multiple meanings in a cogent literary schema. The poet who's most important to my mind in pioneering that is Gertrude Stein. I don't think there's too much doubt. And you read like Tender Buttons, and you read them closely, and you realize just how many different ways you can make each of these little words mean in the grammar that she creates. And so the idea of Dickinson does this too with puns. Puns are another form of double meaning words, right? There's a lot of books that love the idea of play with puns and double entendres and so, excuse my terrible French, and so on. So I think this idea of, it's the language poets, they talk about this a lot, about fracturing meaning, about making meaning as open-ended as possible, and then I mentioned Stanley Fish and reader response theory. That's another way that I see it rippling down today, this idea of words having multiple meanings that all work together. So, language poetry, reader response theory, post-surrealist poetry, post-Steinian poetry. Ashbery, absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, Ashbery employed collage in his second book, The Tennis Court Oath, which was collaged to a large extent from French newspapers that he translated. Ashbery uses collage in his most recent work, in his 2003 book, Wakefulness, and one of the poems in the middle, The Dong with the Luminous Nose, is a cento, which is an old form of collage. Goes all the way back to the Romans, if not earlier, where every line is from a different famous poet. So Ashbery uses collage, absolutely.
And Ashbery had a show of his collages.
Ashbery makes collages. I saw that show. It was great. It was a little collaged out of postcards and scraps that Joe Brainerd had sent him, I believe. Wasn't it Joe Brainerd that sent him the scraps? I forget. And the ones that he made out of the Chutes and Ladders game. That was terrific. Yeah, Ashbery loves collage in all its forms.
He's a better poet than he was an artist.
I would strongly agree with you there. Strongly agree. But if you're a big Ashbery fan like I am, it's still pretty interesting. Anyway. So I hope that...
Would you come back and talk on Ashbery sometime? I can't figure it. Anyway.
The question here.
You said that he was a meticulous collagist, but you also said that he scooped things up from the floor and discovered them. So how much was serendipity or chance a factor in putting things together? Or was he searching for something particular?
That's another fantastic question with deep theoretical ramifications in arts. I mean, the idea of bringing in... I just wanted to talk about that, and I think I probably would have forgotten if you hadn't mentioned it, so I'm grateful for the question. One of to my mind, the 20th century artist that takes found art and collage the furthest and is the most important is Marcel Duchamp and the ready-mades, and how a lot of art historians recognize Duchamp as maybe the most important 20th century artist in terms of influence. And Duchamp, as you know, loved chance operations as a part of his writing. His signature artwork that relies on arbitrary chance operations is what's it called? 3 Standard Stoppages. The one where he took lines of string and just dropped them, and then glued them to, I think, a canvas. I'm not sure, in whatever way they fell. Just the chance curve. So chance operations and incorporating randomness and de-emphasizing writerly authority is a huge part of postmodernity, or in the case of Duchamp, modernism. And again, Whitman is doing it. Like you said, when you're reaching down and pulling up a scrap and thinking, that fits, I'll put that there. You are disrupting the stream of consciousness. The idea of poetry is a cogent outflow of some natural thing that comes one A, B, C, D, E in this process, and you're fracturing it and scattering it, and you're turning the artist into something different. The artist becomes something that's more of a collector. That's a good word. Good. I like that. A collector, an arranger, and a curator of his own ideas and fragments. And because that's such a big part of postmodern art, both in visual arts, in the work of the language poets, in music, in John Cage, terrific example, with his found sounds. Any sound can be music if you call it music, absolutely. Hip-hop music, sampling, techno music, all that stuff involves chance operations. And again, I think you can go back and, although Whitman, didn't influence Biggie Smalls, maybe the fact that he came before such artists is important.
Question here.
Comment. Chance not only like counts as chance, also it breaks down deductive reasoning and allows inductive reasoning. Because in inductive reasoning, you put together things that are disparate into a pattern or form. So a lot of artists use different things in order to make associations, and through the associations create new meanings. And get away from grammar. So things that are not quite narrative. So that's not just that he finds something that fits, but he may find something that doesn't fit, and then it fits.
Exactly. One of the important post-World War II practitioners of collage is William S. Burroughs, author of Naked Lunch. He called them cut-ups. And he didn't really talk about it as a literary aesthetic practice, but a consciousness-changing practice, which I think relates to your discrimination between deductive and inductive thinking. And Burroughs believed that by cutting up his own writing, that he was setting free his consciousness. He called them breaking the word chains. And he thought of it as a kind of meditational activity to discover new forms of thought, new combinations of words that would open up new possibilities for expressing things that previously couldn't be expressed.
Yeah, I guess the strongest connection that I have, especially when you talk about John Cage, is jazz. I'm a psychologist who actually teaches a course in jazz and American identity. The idea of using jazz as a metaphor for this kind of constructive artistic process that involves some basic kind of rhythm, some improvisation, some audience response, and that it becomes part of this mix of creation that I was very struck by that last part, that the reader or the audience is also part of that creative process in the same way that Whitman was. And it sounds also like this idea of sort of coming up with something spontaneously and then organizing it into some schema or I forgot the word that you used, but those kind of skeletal lines or structures, and it really is just fascinating. It was a half century before jazz began, but I'd always enjoyed Whitman's kind of freedom and expressiveness and experience as somehow connected to jazz, and this sort of gives at least some kind of historical perspective. So it's just fascinating.
Jazz presents an interesting case with respect to what I'm talking about, because there is a significant difference in jazz, improvisation-based jazz, in that it takes place in time in a different way. When you play a riff, it's there. You can't take it back. You can't erase it. You can't overstrike it. You can't. It's there. It exists in time in an immediate sense, in an ongoing sense. And so, on the one hand, I don't know how you can collage in that mode, but I think that actually there are elements of collage. For example, when in like a Coltrane solo or something, in a freeform jazz piece, when the jazz artist makes an allusion to a well-known pop melody, and just like I was at a show at the Vanguard a couple months ago, and during a playful solo, it was actually guitar. It was Bill Frisell did the Simpsons riff, dun 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 dun, but did it at a different speed. And that kind of like illusion in jazz, when you'll be doing it with your own melodies that'll come and be arranged, and I guess in a way that's a kind of like collage in time, a collage in immediate time.
More basically is call and response, which is what most of the musicians do. Even if you set the song or the tone, the basic kind of structure, then it becomes, let me show you this, what can you do with it? And the people are really kind of responding to one another. And then the audience listening and egging the group on, or kind of, getting excited about the kind of passion in the music becomes part of that as well. And I think in that sense it's
a collaboration.
Sort of, collaboration, and also a collage. That you're right, the one cut or recording or set is something that goes down in time, but it continues, I think, in the musicians and the listener's minds. So you, for example, remembered that little kind of thing of The Simpsons, but I think tomorrow night or the next time we play this or the next time we listen to this, we could discover something else in that particular music. It's just fascinating, this concept of collage in terms of Whitman. I hadn't really heard about it before.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Yeah.
Ed.
I don't know how to make this distinction clear, but I will try, because I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of collage after seeing the picture. It seems to me what he was doing, he was creating a second mind. He had one mind, which is in his head, and then he was surrounding himself with a second mind, which were all of his ideas that he had written in bits and pieces over a period of time, and were now surrounding him. So just as if you are looking for something, you go into your mind and you try to find it. He was finding it in the second mind.
I might ask, how much agency does that second mind have?
Well, it has the agency of the chance. He went and grabbed something and pulled it out. He liked it, he didn't like it, threw it back, just as when thoughts come to your mind. It seemed to have that kind of a feel, this surrounding with the papers.
So from
Which
that
is
point of view,
different from
then,
chatting. If you kind of put everything, let's say if you're a collage visual artist, and you pick up bits and pieces and you kind of classify them in your studio. You put this here, you put that there, so when I need them, I can go. It didn't have that quality. It was like he lived with it. It was just as if he had two brains. One was on the floor and one was walking.
yeah, he also did it with his own poems in his writing, and it wasn't his only brain. His second brain. The third brain was Leaves of Grass itself, which he kept changing and reordering and restructuring, taking things originally written in prose, the preface to the first edition. He took a large chunk of that, put it in line breaks, and called it By Blue Ontario Shores. So there's probably lots of brains. I like your trope. It's nice.
Is there anything in his life history that would explain his need of creating this second?
Yes, a lot of things. One of the big ones was his experience as a newspaper man in Brooklyn. He worked for 8 newspapers in Brooklyn over various times, most prominently at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which is available online in complete form. And as a newspaper man, and anybody who's ever worked in journalism knows, you're constantly recycling other people's stories. You couldn't make a newspaper on your own. It's you take the newswire, you take what AP or Reuters or whoever gives you, and you make a few changes, and then you call it your own. You appropriate text, and that's what they did then too. They stole from other newspapers and collaged together a copy. And they had their nice divisions and the columns and the sections, and some of it would be written, some of it would be found, just like his poems. So that surely had to have been one big influence on how he discovered this process.
Well, do you know what his attitude was towards his own sexuality?
In what sense?
I mean, was it something he was totally comfortable with? Was it something he was uncomfortable with?
I would say it's something he was remarkably comfortable with, but not totally comfortable with.
My understanding from reading the recent biography of David Reynolds, Walt Whitman in America, where he was constantly saying how many children he had fathered and trying to give impression to the outside world of his heterosexuality rather than his homosexuality.
Yeah, he did lie twice to interviewers about that. Once, relatively early in his life, after he got back from New Orleans, he claimed that he had an affair with this dark lady, that he'd fathered children down there, and he had one today that he'd talked to once or something. That is going to make a nice segue into Cody's poems.
Yeah, I'll talk about that at least a little bit before too long, actually.
Should we move on now?
We maybe. I mean, a couple of quick follow-ups. One about Ed, you mentioned there's several brains, including the one on the floor. Kind of a funny story. When Whitman died, his brain actually was. He was interested in phrenology, and he was interested. He believed that bumps on the skull corresponded with different faculties, your poetic faculty, your how much you loved and whom you loved, and all those kinds of things. And so people wanted to study his brain, and there was some transportation issue where somebody was carrying his brain and actually dropped it on the floor. And there you go. So anything we might have learned from studying the brain of Whitman on the floor, and it just got tossed.
You know what? The guy that carried the brain. This is the same society that preserves great brains. All the
you know that society.
No, there is. They still exist, and they have a museum of brains. Whitman's is lost because the reason you said. But another little great, colorful detail in that story. The fellow, by the way, the Whitman's family was appalled. His caretakers were appalled that they were going to do this. They were going to take his brain out. But Whitman signed it away. He donated his brain, and I love the phrase for what his brain was being carried in. If you read the letter that the messenger, the brain carrier, let's call him that, wrote when he's writing back to the Brain Society, I don't know what their real name is, he says, I dropped Whitman's brain in my gup sack.
Gup sack.
His gup sack. Gupsac.
Which is a word Whitman would have loved, because he loved all the
it just sounds like something that should hold a brain.
Mm-hmm.
Gup sack.
A gup sack. Fantastic. Wow. I love all of this. It's sort of because you're answering the big question, how did he do it? I mean, that's the thing that everybody asks about Whitman. How did he go from being this kind of pedestrian writer, this hack in the 1840s, relative hack, this guy who wrote, as you said, a temperance novel that he once joked he wrote over a weekend with a bottle of sherry at hand, and a writer of fairly conventional verse, to the author of Leaves of Grass. And people generally try to attribute it to, he got his line from the Bible, he got it from opera. He said at one point, I could never have written Leaves of Grass but for the opera, and that gets used as a key. There's this idea that he had a homosexual experience that emotionally opened him up, and that allowed him to become the poet that he became. And then the main thing that people go to is, well, he must have had some mystical experience. He must have gone from being one person to an entirely different person, which we know in our own experience doesn't happen all that much. So I love the idea that your answer for how Whitman became Whitman is it's really it's a technical solution more than it's some kind of transformational mystical experience that we can't really be sure of. Just to show you how it's generally how that transformation generally has been imagined, William Carlos Williams has an essay about Whitman where he says there's a very moving portrait of Whitman facing the breakers coming in on the New Jersey shore when he heard the onomatopoeic waves talk to him direct in a Shakespearean language which might have been Lear himself talking to the storm. But it was not what it seemed. It was a new language, an unnamed language which Whitman could not identify or control. And at that point, Whitman abandoned all order, all sequence and order. It was as if a tornado had struck, which is very cinematic and kind of wonderful. And you want to think of somebody out there on this guy, especially if we want to be Whitman. We want to think that we can go out on the shore and we're writing our little neat poems, and then a tornado strikes and we become Whitman, skirting Sierras and afoot with our vision and all of these things he tells us that he's become in Song of Myself. But do we believe it? And I believe in your idea of this technical achievement, at least in hand with this idea that something spiritual, mystical happened to him. I can't wait to read the book. It's 8:15 right now, and we wanted to read some Whitman out loud, as well as a few poems that owe a debt to Whitman. And we had you print out these 30 pages of poem excerpts from Song of Myself and Crossing Brooklyn Ferry and Respondé. And can we turn to near the back of the packet for people who have it? There's a poem Respondé, and because it's a less well-known poem, I thought it might be interesting to look at. It's one of my very favorite poems of Whitman's, and it's one that has been, to some extent, I think, lost. And the reason for that is that it's not in the 1855 version, the original Leaves of Grass, nor is it in what comes to be known as the deathbed edition. So there's some poems which rise up in, say, the second edition, the 1856, or the third, the 1860, and then they hang on for a few, and then they drop away. And because nobody ever reads those editions, between the first and the last, one editor called them the fallen leaves. And among the fallen leaves, this poem Respondé is, I think a stunning poem. It's so strange. It's Whitman. People have this idea of Whitman as this, as this eternal optimist. And here's this poem that's very dark, deeply ironic, but not entirely ironic. And one of the things I love about Whitman is his balancing of tone, his keeping you kind of tonally a little bit off kilter. The poem is tonally off kilter. So what I wanted to do is, it's a little bit longer, but again, just to have Whitman out here in this conversation, to read this poem, say a few things about it, and see if it strikes people as, if you didn't see Whitman's name attached to this, would you think, aha, this is Whitman? And you probably would because of the catalogs to some extent, but I'm wondering because of, tonally, would it strike you as Whitman-like? It goes like this. Responde, responde. The war is completed. The price is paid. The title is settled beyond recall. Let everyone answer. Let those who sleep be waked. Let none evade. Must we still go on with our affectations and sneaking? Let me bring this to a close. I pronounce openly for a new distribution of roles. So far, so good. It sounds like, okay, a new distribution of roles. I can imagine that. I can be down with that. But look what he assigns now. Let that which stood in front go behind, and let that which was behind advance to the front and speak. Let murderers, bigots, fools, unclean persons offer new propositions. Let the old propositions be postponed. Let faces and theories be turned inside out. Let meanings be freely criminal as well as results. Let there be no suggestion above the suggestion of drudgery. Let none be pointed toward his destination. Say, do you know your destination? And that say is so interesting because up to that point, we're in opposite world, right? Everything is turned on its head. Everything is the opposite of what we might think that Whitman actually believes. But then that little parenthetical interjection, say, do you know your destination? And I think, Jesus, maybe I don't. Let men and women be mocked with bodies and mocked with souls. Let the love that waits in them wait. Let it die or pass stillborn to other spheres. Let the sympathy that waits in every man wait, or let it also pass, a dwarf, to other spheres. Let contradictions prevail. Let one thing contradict another, and let one line of my poems contradict another. And we hear the echo at the end of Song of Myself there. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. In that instance, it's entirely positive. And here, maybe not. Let the people sprawl with yearning, aimless hands. Let their tongues be broken. Let their eyes be discouraged. Let none descend into their hearts with the fresh lusciousness of love. Stifled, O days, O lands, in every public and private corruption. Smothered in thievery, impotence, shamelessness, mountain high, brazen effrontery, scheming, rolling like ocean's waves around and upon you, O my days, my lands. For not even those thunderstorms, nor fiercest lightnings of the war, have purified the atmosphere. Let the theory of America still be management, caste, comparison. Say, what other theory would you? Let them that distrust birth and death still lead the rest. Say, why shall they not lead you? Let the crust of hell be neared and trod on. Let the days be darker than the nights. Let slumber bring less slumber than waking time brings. Let the world never appear to him or her for whom it was all made. Let the heart of the young man still exile itself from the heart of the old man, and let the heart of the old man be exiled from that of the young man. Let the sun and moon go. Let scenery take the applause of the audience. Let there be apathy under the stars. Let freedom prove no man's inalienable right. Everyone who can tyrannize, let him tyrannize to his satisfaction. Let none but infidels be countenanced. Let the imminence of meanness, treachery, sarcasm, hate, greed, indecency, impotence, lust be taken for granted above all. Let writers, judges, governments, households, religions, philosophies take such for granted above all. Let the worst men beget children out of the worst women. Let the priest still play at immortality. Let death be inaugurated. Let nothing remain but the ashes of teachers, artists, moralists, lawyers, and learned and polite persons. Let him who is without my poems be assassinated. One of my favorite lines in the entire collected Leaves of Grass. And now here comes another one. Let the cow, the horse, the camel, the garden bee, let the mudfish, the lobster, the mussel, eel, the stingray, and the grunting pigfish, let these and the like of these be put on perfect equality with man and woman. And I think of Whitman just loving, I imagine him loving saying, grunting pigfish. He talked about getting the blab of the pave into his poetry, the raciness of the English language. Let churches accommodate serpents serpents, vermin, and the corpses of those who have died of the most filthy of diseases. Let marriage slip down among fools and be for none but fools. Let men among themselves talk and think forever obscenely of women, and let women among themselves talk and think obscenely of men. Let us all, without missing one, be exposed in public, naked, monthly, at the peril of our lives. Let our bodies be freely handled and examined by whoever chooses. Let nothing but copies at second hand be permitted to exist upon the earth. This is the same person who, when I heard the learned astronomer, tells you to go out and experience the world directly. He doesn't mean this. Let the earth desert God, nor let there ever henceforth be mentioned the name of God. Let there be no God. Let there be money, business, imports, exports, custom, authority, precedence, pallor, dyspepsia, smut, ignorance, unbelief. Let judges and criminals be transposed. Let the prison keepers be put in prison. Let those that were prisoners take the keys. Say, why might they not just as well be transposed? And he's imagining almost a Feast of Fools reversal right there. Let the slaves be masters. Let the masters become slaves. Let the reformers descend from the stands where they are forever bawling. Let an idiot or insane person appear on each of the stands. Let the Asiatic, the African, the European, the American, and the Australian go armed against the murderous stealthiness of each other. Let them sleep armed. Let none believe in goodwill. And if you read the poem The Sleepers, or if you do, you'll see the exact opposite image where the Europeans and Africans and Asiatics are sleeping hand in hand. Let there be no unfashionable wisdom. Let such be scorned and derided off from the earth. And I love this next one. Let a floating cloud in the sky, let a wave of the sea, let growing mint, spinach, onions, tomatoes, let these be exhibited as shows at a great price for admission. Let all the men of these states stand aside for a few smouchers. Let the few seize on what they choose. Let the rest gawk, giggle, starve, obey. Let shadows be furnished with genitals. Let substances be deprived of their genitals. Let there be wealthy and immense cities, but still through any of them, not a single poet, savior, knower, lover. Let the infidels of these states laugh all faith away. If one man be found who has faith, let the rest set upon him. Let them affright faith. Let them destroy the power of breeding faith. Let the she-harlots and the he-harlots, love that he-harlots, be prudent. Let them dance on while seeming lasts. Oh, seeming, as opposed to being, right? And Wallace Stevens is the emperor of ice cream. Let be finale of seem. Be is on a higher plane. Let the preachers recite creeds. Let them still teach only what they have been taught. Let insanity still have charge of sanity. Let books take the place of trees, animals, rivers, clouds. Let the daubed portraits of heroes supersede heroes. Let the manhood of man never take steps after itself. Let it take steps after eunuchs and after consumptive and genteel persons. Love that pairing. Let the white person again tread the black person under his heel. Say, which is trodden under heel after all. And again, it's that parenthetical interjection that actually pulls you away for a moment and you think, yeah, actually, if you oppress people, that comes around and it does something oppressive to you. Let the reflections of the things of the world be studied in mirrors. Let the things themselves still continue unstudied. Let a man seek pleasure everywhere except in himself. That's not the Whitman I know. Let a woman seek happiness everywhere except in herself. What real happiness have you had one single hour through your whole life? And I've read this poem hundreds and hundreds of times. Every time I get to that line, I think, oh my God, none! And I'm terrified, and it's not true. I know it's not true, but I just at that moment he gets me. And that's the tonal play that I'm talking about. This poem is 93% ironic. We're in opposite land, but that's 7% you have to be ready for. What real happiness have you had one single hour through your whole life? And suddenly I feel as if Whitman has been watching me the whole time. Let the limited years of life do nothing for the limited years of death. what do you suppose death will do then? And the answer, of course, is not a goddamn thing. And it frightens you. And so here's again this poem that has been existing mostly in the world of opposites, mostly in the register of irony, but it just pierces through that irony enough times to be, I think, stunningly strange and affecting, and yet it's not a poem that is widely read. It's starting to creep into anthologies a little bit. So anyway, I thought we'd have a little bit of Whitman, more of Whitman's words thrown into the mix. We're running short on time, and we wanted to read a few poems inspired, or at least informed by Whitman, and also take time for a few more questions. So Matt, do you want to give us, you have a poem to share?
Sure. Yeah, when the, I guess, whose plan was it, yours or Polly's, contacted me, that they asked if I had any Whitman poems. Cody has a whole sequence of poems written to Whitman. I just have one, and it's about 4 years old. And I read it for the first time in years this morning, and the first part seemed terrible. So I rewrote the first 10 lines about 3 hours ago. So, yeah, anyway. It has the creative title, Walt Whitman. So here you go. Here in a middle period, there is no time, we read, before the screen began blinking away. No inclusive listing. No realized pulse, nothing to scorn or affirm us. A determined thought is enough to hold a life together, but any more scatters into minor tones. Then we sing our lives. Song of the... That's one way to do it. But I like the new way too, reinvesting words in the dream tank and keeping them there until the truth declines, the trippers and askers, and the whole audience sees what's still at stake, a sax, a tryst, dumb clarity we can live with, the way the light impresses the wall over and over if we remember to untilt the blinds. And when they feed us to this light, it's just another haze to be struggled through. Reasons not to get the job done. Your course keeps rocking away. Can you hear me over there through the end, old man? I'll look for you under the treadmill. And if the country you sang bleeps back, its sound is still your sound, companionable and crude. We'll keep feeding you for some time now, don't worry. It's us, not you, who hired the madmen steering the death ship. You said we face a lucky threshold, our edge or theirs.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah. Okay. I think I've never read sitting down before. I was thinking about getting up, but maybe I'll
get up?
Yeah, I think I'll get up. Why not? I take this off then?
Yeah, you got to take this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to read. Am I mic'd or am I loud enough? I'm going to read from this book, Shuffle and Breakdown, that came out a few months ago, and the title comes from a section of Song of Myself, where Whitman says, "The butcher boy puts off his killing clothes or sharpens his knife at the stall in the market. I loiter, enjoying his repartee and his shuffle and breakdown." And Shuffle and Breakdown, they're two dances mostly performed on the minstrel stage in the 19th century. A shuffle was a slow kind of sliding type dance, adagio type dance, and a breakdown would be a louder, rowdier, more boisterous dance. And I like the idea of having both of those motions in a well, certainly in a single title and perhaps in a single book. I'm going to read a few poems in which I guess Whitman makes an appearance, I'll just say that, and then a few where he's directly addressed. This first one is called Update, and I published this poem on Slate.com a couple of years ago, I guess it was. And on Slate, you can weigh in, something called The Fray. You can see if you like something or not. And I think this was the most hated poem ever to appear on Slate. Somebody said that this poem is worse than our fiasco in Iraq. And somebody else said it was Exhibit A as to why mentally deranged people shouldn't write poems.
Isn't that a line from one of Whitman's self-reviews?
It's certainly he was. I have a list of some of the actual reviews, including the slop bucket of Walt Whitman. But there's one where he's called a lunatic raving in pitiable delirium. Anyway, update. My latent superpowers, well, they're back. Obliterate a marriage with my mind. Bewitch the president, that lying sack of Cody. Take it slow. In time, I'll find, please note I'm speaking as my therapist, the equilibrium that time affords. I've also rerouted, I have a list, 1, my neural pathways, and 2, some fjords. America is a country for the lonely, the loony. Whitman said it years ago. Remember, he could fly, and he was only an editor, a winged, bearded schmo. My powers have increased 100-fold since you left, maybe 1,000 all told. This next one quotes from Responde near the end. It's called The Cheney Correspondence Selected. Dear Dick Cheney, today I could barely leave the house. I flipped through magazines. I ate crackers. I checked my email a lot. Do you sometimes feel that things are both important and unimportant? Now I'm at a coffee shop, but the day's basically over. Imagine being 40, but still feeling like a character in a sketch. Hope all's well with you. Yours truly, Cody Walker. Dear Dick Cheney, when I was younger, I wanted to be a baseball player, but I can't remember whether I loved baseball or whether I just wanted everyone to love me. A confession, then. I still want everyone to love me, blindly, entirely, without sense or reason. Even you, whom I've regularly excoriated. Fondly, Cody Walker. Dear Dick Cheney, I'm going a bit bald. Other than what it portends, dotage, death, it doesn't bother me. I'm also getting fat, which does bother me. Have I told you how beautiful I find most women, especially from a distance? I keep circling back to this line from Whitman. What real happiness have you had 1 single hour through your whole life? I hope you won't be too offended if I say that I have difficulty picturing you making love to Lynn or to anyone, but I can easily picture you in a bathroom at 3 in the morning. I don't know how people picture me. Maybe with a pen and a clutch of flowers and bile in my throat. Warm regards to you and your family, Cody Walker. This is called All Poetry is Political. Arnold Schwarzenegger stepped on a beggar woman, then gave her a signed photo of himself and Gary Soto. Carolyn Forche sat in a bookstore cafe practicing her 30-yard stare because spies everywhere. Walt Whitman didn't hire a hitman, nor blubber the words, heck of a job, when, hey, what's that thingamabob? Dude, that's my heart. And the funny part is that it's half dead with fear and half Edward Lear. Dirge. Hooray for the dead, Walt Whitman, Einstein, and the soon-to-be undone, Madonna, you, me, everyone. And then the last section of this book is, as Matt mentioned, is a series of letters addressed to Whitman. And they're from an imagined grandson of Whitman, and so mention was made of his lying about his sexual orientation, and it was John Addington Symonds who, in 1890, wrote a letter to Whitman, basically, congratulating him for being so obviously out. And this is near the end of Whitman's life. He's going to be dead in a couple of years. And he said, no, God, that's not at all what I meant by the Calamus poems and how awful that they were taken that way. And he pretty much makes up on the spot these mythic children and grandchild. He says, though always unmarried, this is in his letter to Simmons, though always unmarried, I have had 6 children. 2 are dead, 1 living Southern grandchild, fine boy, who writes to me occasionally. And I thought, I could be that living Southern grandchild, the fine boy who writes to him occasionally, because in some ways I think that as a poet, poets are often trying to reach out to something bigger than themselves, and who bigger than Whitman? So I basically came up with this imagined grandson whom I call Caleb, who's journeying around the American South and Midwest and finally Mid-Atlantic for about 3 years between 1889 and 1892, and he's trying to get to his grandfather, get to Walt. He's never met him, but he's writing him letters along the way as he travels with his girlfriend Susanna, whom he usually calls Xana, and their dog Smoke. And I'll read just a few of them. The first one is called Hepzibah Cemetery, April 1889. Hepzibah means my delight is in thee, but that light is gone, Walt. That light's been snuffed by the rain clouds. The headstones warp open, they're plundered by snakes. Xana half saves them with chalk rubbings. Why come to Hepzibah? The magnolias moan, with their sickly sweet blossoms I taste in my sleep. Why spread dumbstruck ashes at the creek's fat mouth? Why do anything, Walt? It's a direct question. Xana sends you love she doesn't have to spare, and decorates our tent with epitaphs. Dead forever, reads her grandmums. Sadly, I'm lying. Write me some way to recast this sky, rub the clouds to blue slate, wring pulp from the sun. Let jackdaws be mourning doves, let mourning be delight. Let ashes be snow, dust sweet enough to eat. Make me take back the comment, no love to spare. Xana's a copperhead angel, a sage-mouthed blossom, something to press against in the rain. Wrecked, moored in Georgia, Caleb. Natchez, December 1889. We've camped for a week under a black cottonwood. Colors are unraveling, Walt, growing phantom deep like the river, which is raw silver, icy silt. A boy died in it. We got here the day the stern wheeler sank. We saw the flag officer frantic. We saw mud-skinned men drop nets as the sun set over the staggered bluffs. There was nothing to do. We turned away. All week, Smokes lulled in the cottonwood's gloom, a river god guarding Xana from the rip current. Or I'm wishing this, Walt, because the nights are the same, because Xana pours the water of the drowned boy down her shoulders, and I sweep it off her body in the bone-white moonlight. Adrift in Mississippi, Caleb. And then a bunch of other things happen. They go to New Orleans, Joplin, St. Louis. They arrive in Chicago, where things are not going so well. And I should mention that 40-rod whiskey is whiskey strong enough to throw a man 40 rods, which is a good ways. Chicago, June 1891. I wrote you a long letter last week, then threw it in the lake. It ended, your optimism is wrong, it alone sustains me. We're sharing a Van Buren shanty with a masher named Carl, who fingers 40-rod whiskey and scones from wholesale houses. Xana went with him and stole a ham, a 7-pound ham, Walt, stuffed in her coat. Each morning I tramped to Jackson Park, lug girders with 6,000 workers. A wheel's going up. It'll eat the sky. It'll laugh and spit corpses on the lakefront. I come home at night and find Xana drunk. Carl is eating codfish in a corner. The exposition lamps leave our eyes burning. I clutch Smoke. I know that wheel will crash. bedraggled in the White City, Caleb. And as they make their way finally to Camden, Xana leaves Caleb right before he gets to Camden. So the last poem in this in the collection features Caleb, and Smoke is still around, but not Xana. And I should mention this is 3 months after Whitman's death. It's June of 1892, and Whitman's housekeeper Mary Oakes Davis would have still been in the house with her dog named Watch. So we have both Smoke the dog and Watch the dog in this poem. And this is in the way that Matt's poem quoted a little bit from Song of Myself. This poem quotes a tiny bit from the end of Song of Myself. Camden, June 1892. This is the letter no one will see. This is me in your house, Walt, 30 blocks from your grave. This is 6 in the evening, Mickle Street light, Smoke and Watch raving like syphilitics in the yard. This is my heartbreak coda, my withered why, my stormy yawp, my deluge off the Delaware. I can tell you 2 things. 1, Xana gone isn't Xana canceled. And 2, I have no boots. I've worn them through. You understand the problem. In a dream, you, Xana, Smoke, and I floated over this city. You read us poems. I've never properly told you what a great poet I think you are. Beneath us, men fixed bicycles and drank steam beer. Women brought the sun up. We watched this, Walt, in untranslatable wonder. Packing my bags before the appraisers come, Caleb. Thanks.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philip Tades events is available at philiptades.org.